Thank you, Tremia. Thank you all very much for coming. It's good to see you all here. We are at the beginning of our 150th marathon. For us, at least, we have 4 battles around here. Gettysburg gets off with 1 and Antietam, but we have 4. And I have brought tonight, if you haven't got it, there are some copies floating around, a copy of the program of events for the 150th weekend. We hope you'll go and pass them along. We have 15,000 of these things, so don't be shy about it. This weekend, Mia spoke about C-SPAN. C-SPAN is coming again this weekend to film our Years of Anguish series at the Baptist Church on a Saturday afternoon, which features the 2 greatest historians of the Battle of Fredericksburg, George Rabel and Frank O'Reilly will be speaking, and also Susanna Ural will speak on the Irish Brigade's experience at the Battle of Fredericksburg. But tonight, we're doing things a little bit out of order. My job is to talk about aftermath. Heidi, you there? Are you ready? This man, well, you often hear his name in connection with Fredericksburg, and indeed he came here in December of 1862. As he walked about through the camps looking for his brother, whom he found fairly quickly and largely unscathed, he kept a small notebook and jotted down observations and ideas, and some of these jottings would later become the basis of other writings. At one point during his meanderings through the camp in Stafford County, he wrote this in his notebook: "Sighted daybreak, in camp, in front of the hospital tents. On stretcher, 3 dead men lying, each with a blanket spread over them. I lift up one and look at the young man's face, calm and yellow. 'Tis strange. Young man, I think this face of yours, the face of my dead Christ." This passage, written hastily in a small notebook by Whitman, will become the basis of a poem. It's a poem that expresses the profound revelation that Whitman experienced here at Fredericksburg. And it's a revelation that is mirrored in the nation, not just connected with this battle, but with this war. It is a poem called "A Sight in Camp in the Daybreak, Gray and Dim." A sight in camp in the daybreak, gray and dim. As from my tent I emerged so early, sleepless. As slow I walk in the cool, fresh air, the path near the hospital tent. 3 forms I see on stretchers lying, brought out there, untended, lying. Over each the blanket spread, ample brownish woolen blanket, gray and heavy blanket, folding, covering all. Curious, I halt, in silent stand. Then with light fingers, I from the face of the nearest first, just lift the blanket. Who are you, elderly man, so gaunt and grim, with well-grayed hair and flesh all sunken about the eyes? Who are you, my dear comrade? Then to the second I step. And who are you, my child and darling? Who are you, my sweet boy, with cheeks yet blooming? And then to the third, a face nor child nor old, very calm, as of beautiful yellow white ivory. Young man, I think I know you. I think this face is the face of Christ himself, dead and divine and brother of all. And here again, he lies. For Whitman, understanding the nature and intensity of the war also accorded the war its meaning and purpose. He would dedicate his life for the next several years caring for the wounded, working in the hospitals, writing letters for soldiers, as men unfamous, many of them unknown to us, shaped the spirit and will of one of America's great writers, facing things, doing things that Whitman knew he could never do himself. Think of this moment after the Battle of Fredericksburg, the aftermath. Think of it in these terms. The moment of catastrophe. We all have experienced one. The moment of a car crash. The seconds after impact. The morning of 9/11. Or when you injure yourself, cut your leg with a chainsaw. That moment, before the dust settles, before the reality is known, that moment of disarray and confusion and fear, of understanding and misunderstanding. And it takes time for those moments to clear before we can understand what it all means. And so tonight, my purpose is to take us into that moment, after the crash, before the dust has settled, and to see what these people experienced, understood, and what they learned. What did it mean for them, and what did it mean for our nation? The backdrop of all that we talk about tonight is not a happy vision of war. The purpose of war, we often forget, is to make the other side hurt so badly, to make them suffer so much, that the only viable alternative for them is to give up. Hurt and pain, and destruction and disarray, and sorrow and sadness are the real tools of war. It is how those men who suffer and die, and how their losses reverberate across our nation, that ultimately determines whether the experience will steel a nation to greater things, to victory, or whether the experience will cause a nation to stumble and perhaps even crumble. Each of these battles presented immense challenges to those who were involved in them. Commanders bore the weight of nations on their shoulders. Soldiers bore the weight of fate and the stress of bearing witness to the horrible fates of their brethren, transformed, many of them dead. Civilians here at Fredericksburg, unaware, consumed by this event, they transformed too. A community transformed, swept up in this ongoing disaster. War imposed a weight on this land that we can hardly fathom today. So tonight, we're going to look at that period after the catastrophe, before the dust settles, and see what we can learn about people and our nation. The aftermath of the Battle of Fredericksburg began before, in fact, the shooting even stopped. Edward L. Heineken, who was a shopkeeper on William Street, who kept a confectioner there. There were 13 confectioners, by the way, in Fredericksburg in 1860. I suspect it was the per capita sweetest town in America. But even before the bombardment was over, and during the lull, Heineken took a walk in the streets. In fact, he walked right along this route that we're looking here, Princess Anne Street toward the courthouse in St. George's. I soon left my friend's house to take a walk through town during a lull in the bombardment, meeting many people, few in the streets, but many more or less sheltered in their houses, eagerly watching the havoc from doors and windows. And I must say that few, women and men, showed any fear but plenty of excitement. I saw one man, a black man, crouching behind a thin plank fence where he imagined himself perfectly safe from shot and shell. And he invited me to join him there. Meeting Judge John M. Herndon, Mr. Herndon remarked in his most pleasant manner, "This looks as if we have had a most extraordinary hailstorm today." Notwithstanding all the uproar, Mrs. Guy gave us a very comfortable dinner that evening. For soldiers, the air aftermath came often, quickly, and unexpectedly. A young soldier from the 3rd United States Infantry found himself under Confederate fire out at the Herkamp's Tannery on William Street, out where the apartments are at the bottom of the hill. It's just as you start up toward Mary Washington. Private Drake, a witness said, was shot through the neck while on picket in front of this tannery. He fell, staggered to his feet, looked about in a dazed way, tried to reach the corner of the tannery, fell into a ditch with the bullets of the sharpshooters striking the bank near him. He staggered to his feet again and looked about in such a pitiful way that flesh and blood could bear it no longer. And a couple of the men behind the tannery rushed forward, seized him, and pulled him behind the sheltering brick walls amid a shower of bullets. Another soldier recounted his own wound as his regiment advanced against Marie's Heights on December 13th. He was heading to the rear. His regiment had been up to the crest, or as far as they would get, and then ordered to turn around. I can only see the dead and the wounded, he said. And alongside of me was my old messmate, Carlton. Doc, can I help you? I said. Yes, Pat, he said, and I stopped and took him by the arm to lift him, when all at once I felt myself strike the ground, and the hot blood run all over my face and neck. I tried to get up, but it was of no use. So a man of the 26th New York took me by the arm and brought me to the rear and put me on a stretcher. I was shot just back at the head by a mini bullet. The ball broke the bone and passed into the head, but has since been taken out. A breath more strength given to the ball would have sent it through my head. I am all right now, and soon will be well, he wrote to his family at home. Another soldier fell on the south end of the field, consumed his last moments on earth, writing a note to his family. On the battlefield, December 12th or 13th, 1862, George Parsons wasn't sure exactly what the date was. Dear Father, I write you while lying on the battlefield, wounded, perhaps fatally, and very weak. I fell wounded in the side. Goodbye if I ever see you again. Tell Mother I think of her while lying here, and I wish I had her to be with me in my last parting moments. Much love to all. I fell while doing my duty. Farewell. I may never see you again on earth, but I hope to meet you in heaven, where there will be no fight. Affectionately, George R. Parsons, 16th Maine Infantry. One of the great distinguishing characteristics of the Battle of Fredericksburg was the omnipresence of fear. Now, fear was present on all battlefields, but at Fredericksburg, especially among Union troops, facing those heights, they understood very well the consequences of moving against that place. And so they felt fear, and they expressed fear more openly than many of their comrades on other battlefields. And so the relief of exiting battle was all the more greater. One man from Maine wrote after his regiment came out, I felt a strange exultation. I had passed unscathed through the valley of the shadow and was no longer a slave to the fear that at first had nearly overpowered me. I was horribly glad to be alive and unhurt. What mattered if men around me had fallen and shrieked in agony, pleaded for succor, cried and prayed and cursed? I was safe. Dead at the moment to all human sympathy. The Union troops, many of them spilled back into town, finding themselves exhausted. The streets of Fredericksburg filled with men recovering from the shock of what they had been through. One man wrote, some sat on the curbstone, meditating, looking gloomily at the ground. Others lay on the pavement trying to forget the events and find sleep. There was little said. Deep dejection burdened the spirits of all. Always when one man spoke, it was of a slain comrade. Thus they lay or sat. Abner Small of the 16th Maine recorded the impact of the battle, of the experience of battle, on his men who had never before been in battle. He said, I went down the line of my regiment. Fewer than half of its men surviving, weary and dirty, their clothes torn and muddy, knapsacks rent, canteens battered, hands and faces daubed with muck and splotched with powder. There were pale faces and faces flushed, anxious and expectant faces, many that I had scanned 3 days before. The same now, but changed. There was something in the expression, the attitude of those men that awed me. An uprush of emotion blinded and choked me as I turned away. The Battle of Fredericksburg unleashed a flood of suffering, of human injury on this community. Almost 13,000 men wounded on both sides during the battle. Now mind you, I counted up in about 2002 that within 80 miles of Fredericksburg in Virginia, there were 11,000 hospital beds. There were 13,000 men wounded in Fredericksburg on December 13th, 1862. About half of them would be hospitalized. Now the Confederates had a great advantage in this respect because they had the railroad. And their challenge was simply to move the wounded from the battlefield to the railroad. One man described the scene along what was certainly Mine Road in Spotsylvania. He said, from the road from the point to the immediate, from the rail line to the immediate rear of the battle line was lined during the whole day with ambulances and wagons, which were engaged in conveying the wounded to this point, from whence they would be sent to the waiting trains to your city at the Richmond. So this time you drive Mine Road from Spotsylvania into that. By far, and here we're going to focus tonight, by far the greatest challenge at Fredericksburg faced the Union Army. Of course, a lot of that is rooted in disaster. But a lot of that, too, is rooted in the past of the Army as it related to the treatment of wounded. And first, at the First Battle of Manassas, in July of 1861, just 15 months prior to this, the Army, in its attempt to lighten the load, to shorten the wagon trains, had ordered the medical wagons to stay behind in Washington, D.C. And so the wounded on that field had suffered much. Since then, there had been a tremendous effort to upgrade the care of the wounded. In fact, an effort that would result in a system that we all are very familiar with today. A system of primary care and triage, a system of intervention where necessary, and transport, and ultimately recovery in a depot hospital. Heidi? So much had changed, but still more was about to change. A lot of these efforts that the Yankees had made were the product of this man, the man on the left in the lower corner, Jonathan Letterman. Most of you have probably heard of Letterman. One of the great unsung heroes of the American Civil War. Probably is responsible for saving more lives during the American Civil War than any single individual. He was the medical director of the Army of the Potomac. He instituted, just before the Battle of Fredericksburg, a new system of hospitals that were organized at a higher level in the Army, at the division level. I'm not going to get real technical about it, but before, hospitals were with every regiment. And there were dozens, hundreds of regiments in the Army. By consolidating hospitals in this way, every soldier could know where their hospital was before they went into battle. Every commander knew where their hospitals were. And all the transport could be mustered to get men to these hospitals. And the result of Letterman's efforts and the efforts of hundreds and thousands of medical workers at the Battle of Fredericksburg was that the hospital system, the care of the wounded, was just about the only thing that worked for the Union Army. And I would offer to you what, as bad as the outcome of the battle was in terms of its reverberation across the American landscape, how much worse would it have been if the Army had also failed the wounded, which they did not. Before the battle began, I've done this little rough map, the Union Army established division-level hospitals throughout southern Stafford County. You can see Fredericksburg off on the left-hand side of the map. I just give you an idea of where all these hospitals were. There's White Oak Road. Here's Chatham up there. Falmouth Station, where the Eagles Lodge is today. And then you see all the red circles up in what is today the Grafton subdivision in Stafford County. These division hospitals were established before the battle began, in the days before the battle began. And maybe it's a sign of pessimism that when the Union Army crossed into Fredericksburg, these hospitals were not available. There were clearly some who feared that the Union Army might be coming back, and so all of these hospitals would be used in the aftermath of battle. But in fact, there would be a two-tiered system, because these are division hospitals that are in the rear. They would also set up hospitals on this side of the river as well, in the town. And those are the hospitals that you've heard of, in the Baptist Church, in the courthouse, in the various residences here in town. As the shooting started, the bandsmen set up the hospitals here in town. One at the Baptist Church, probably the most famous church in town, as we're having our Years of Anguish thing here at this church this weekend. They threw the pews out the windows onto the sidewalk. They cleared the sanctuary, trying to create as much space as possible, and soon had wounded rolling in. St. George's, the courthouse, St. Mary's Catholic Church, which still stands on Princess Anne Street, the Methodist Church, now gone, all of these places, and innumerable houses, including Smithsonian and the house right across the street owned by SS Howson, were major hospitals in town. Now, regimental surgeons still existed in the Army, and they went forward with their regiments, and they established forward aid stations, and they would take whatever house they could find, and it was here that some of the most vivid scenes and most written about scenes in the field hospitals took place. One man wrote of the process of starting up these field hospitals. The wounded are carried to the nearest house, a little whiskey is given, and some encouraging words are spoken. One whose leg is found to be shattered is placed upon a table. The chances to be in the room, chloroform is administered, the tourniquet applied, and the leg is speedily amputated. The other, whose scapula and upper part of his humerus have been laid bare and shattered, has had some loose splinters gently removed, and a lint applied as a dressing, so that he may be satisfied the surgeons are not unmindful of him. But the surgeons, of course, had little hope. One surgeon from New York took up quarters in a carriage house. In fact, it may well be the carriage house that stood on what is today the courthouse block. That was the subject of archaeology a couple of weeks ago, so famously in the New York Times yesterday. As a matter of fact, I believe there was an article about that. And he wrote of his field hospital thus. He said, there was room enough to accommodate 50 or 75 of the wounded. And I do not think it was an hour, or in fact half an hour, before this number was brought in. The roads and streets were very muddy and wet, and the floor on which I was obliged to lay the wounded soon became equally so. But notwithstanding, I was obliged to lay them down upon this muddy, wet, cold floor, only their blankets beneath them, and these in many instances saturated with their own blood. I had only time to perform such operations and dress such of the wounded as was required by the most urgent necessity, and this, in most cases, in a temporary and superficial manner. In these hospitals, men encountered situations that sometimes unnerved them and almost always challenged them. A chaplain from Pennsylvania wrote about this in a hospital that was probably on Hanover Street. Some of the wounded of our regiment were brought into the parlor of the house we occupied, which was elegantly furnished. The first few were but slightly wounded. Then was brought in one who was still a boy. His name was William Wicks, Company D, who was wounded in the groin. He once recognized me. His groaning was loud and heartrending. Chaplain, he said, why don't you kill me? It is cruel to let me suffer so. It is a mercy to kill me. I could hardly stand this. I tried to compose him. Medicine was given to deaden the pain, but it was of little avail. He knew he must die. And then came thoughts and fears of eternity, and he spoke to me about his soul. I knelt by his side, offered a short prayer, and did all to make his suffering less excruciating. And so these battles slash and cut and harm and hurt the body, the mind, and the soul. All day the stretcher bearers toiled, carrying bodies up the roads into Fredericksburg. One man said, it is hard work to carry wounded men, not because of their heaviness, but because of their cries and groans. They are heartrending. One man described a scene in the Episcopal Church in the basement, the lower level of the Episcopal Church, where almost all of you at one time or another had lunch, probably. In the lecture room of the Episcopal Church, 8 operating tables were in full blast. The floor was densely packed with men whose limbs were crushed, fractured, and torn. Lying there in deep pools of blood, they waited patiently. There was no grumbling, no screaming, hardly a moan. Many of the badly hurt were smiling and chatting, and one who had both legs shot off was cracking jokes with an officer who could not laugh at the humorous sallies, for his lower jaw was shot away. The cases here were nearly all capital, and amputation was almost always resorted to. Hands and feet and arms and legs were thrown under each table. The delicate limbs of the drummer boy fell along with the rough hand of the veteran. But everyone was brave and cheerful. Hospitals saved lives, of course, but they also produced death, for many to die in these hospitals. A surgeon from New York remembered this. All hands were busy. Decisions involving loss of limbs or life were quickly made and executed. Cooks, attendants, and slightly wounded soldiers were actively employed. And the Pioneer Corps began sad labor of opening a long trench to receive the bodies of those that died. The burial service is simple. A dozen bodies are laid side by side in the trench. They are covered with blankets, and the clothing stripped from wounded parts. A piece of board bearing in pencil an inscription of the name, rank, and company is placed at the head of each, and the earth is again thrown over them, leaving the further end of the trench open to receive the next comers. As an exceptional usage, a chaplain will at times pronounce a few words of exhortation and prayer among the few who gather around, but the greater part are interred without any religious services whatever. Night on the battlefield. The ground in front of Marie's Heights, in the neighborhood now, that stands along Mercer Street and Willis Street, in Little Page Street, was the scene of a night of harrowing intensity that most who wrote about it, or most who witnessed it, remember. There was the darkness which belongs to night. The Southerners were quiet and close behind their works. Then from each regiment, a lieutenant with a small party went up the ascent and sought in the darkness what fate had befallen the missing. They brought care to the wounded. They went from man to man as they lay on the ground. In the darkness, it was hard to distinguish the features of the slain, and so they felt for the letters and numbers on their caps. Whatsoever man of their regiment they discovered, they bore him off if wounded. If dead, they took the valuables and mementos found on his person for his friends and left him to lie on the earth where he had fallen. A soldier from Connecticut wrote this about the battlefield. Those who say they would like to visit a battlefield seldom know what they are talking about. After darkness has put an end to the struggle and a hush settles over the field, such a contrast to the roar of the fight, never a silence more oppressive. You hear the cries of the wounded, which is never heard in battle. A stray shot hurtles through the darkness overhead. You hear the ambulance wheels grinding through the soil with a sullen, muffled sound like some monster. You see the outlines of forms gliding through the gloom, carrying on litters of pale, bloody men. Or perhaps your friend with his hair matted in blood over his white face and his dead eyes staring blindly up to the sky. And so the war cuts and hurts and scars. The stretcher bearers redoubled their efforts in Fredericksburg. At 7 o'clock on the night of the 13th, the ambulances were ordered across the river to begin carrying the wounded to the rear. And in fact, that night, and the Union accounts are pretty consistent about this, Union medical authorities claim that not a single wounded soldier who was within Union lines was not transported to a hospital that night. The only ones who remained behind were those who were in no man's land. Meanwhile, the work at the hospitals continued. Our surgeon from New York, who was in the carriage house on Princess Anne Street, I confess to you that I did not expect to survive, he said. I was engaged till midnight in amputating and dressing wounds and otherwise providing for the sufferers. Withal, I was obliged to hear the groans and cries of the wounded and dying. And without the bursting and screaming of the shells, the roar of the cannon and musketing, which did not remit for a moment until darkness. But in the darkness, a silence outside but served to render the groans and cries of agony, which arose from the wounded and dying within, more distinct. In the midst of it all, I am alive and well, he said. The next day, and on December 15th, the Army began the process of evacuating the wounded from Fredericksburg. On December 14th, Ambrose Burnside decided that, in fact, he would not renew the attack on Fredericksburg. And on the 15th, the ambulances began the process of evacuating the wounded. The effort entailed a great deal of planning. They found this great account, and this is how they did it. They didn't bring all the ambulances into town and just send them into the streets. What they did was they ordered the wounded to either be carried or to walk themselves to Sophia Street. And meanwhile, the ambulances crossed at the middle crossing, down at Ferry Farm, and then turned up Sophia Street and moved along Sophia Street, picking up men who needed transport, and continued up Sophia Street to the upper crossing at Hawk Street, and then down across the river again, and up the land, up the driveway at 10. The process of moving the wounded to those ambulances presented a spectacle that many men remembered. All of my wounded, Surgeon Welch said of New York, who could not walk, I was obliged to have taken on litters which I made from the wooden blinds of the house, or boards as I could find them. Ambulances I could get none, and I only had one stretcher at my command. One man whose arm I had amputated within 2 or 3 inches of his shoulder walked at least a half a mile to the pontoon bridge. Another man described the scenes in the streets. As you walk out tonight, ponder this. My God, spare us the pain of such another sight. For 8 long hours, the streets were crowded with the mutilated victims of Saturday's fighting. Those of you who have the use of their limbs are hobbling along as best they can. Many on crutches of their own manufacture. Many are leaning for support, others but slightly wounded, and thousands are being borne along on stretchers, moved to ambulances. The heart sickens at such a sight of suffering. Some are pale and ghastly, and all are more or less mangled. Some have lost their legs, their arms, hundreds with wounded heads. One poor fellow seemed to have lost both eyes. In one instance, I saw a man but slightly wounded carrying another on his back. And yet from all these bleeding, suffering thousands, I heard hardly a groan or complaint. Hundreds are left dead among the hospitals. The ambulances would cross the river. Did we go on too far? Not sure what we're looking at there. Go one more, as a matter of fact. One more, sorry about that. One more still, those are ambulances. And this is a picture of a wagon train actually crossing at Ferry Farm in 1864. And the scene certainly looked very similar as the ambulances came across on December 15th. So the ambulances did their work and carried these men, thousands of them, back into the hospitals in Stafford County. Most of those hospitals, those division hospitals, were in tents. The Union Army had about 500 hospital tents available, enough for more than 5,000 men. And so these tents scattered across the landscape, around Falmouth Station, around the Phillips House, and all along the railroad up toward Aquia Landing. But by far the most famous of all the hospitals in Stafford County was this one, Chet, on the heights overlooking the river. It was the hospital of the 2nd Division of the 2nd Corps, which suffered as much as any. It was here that Clara Barton did her work. She also came into town briefly on the 13th. The only woman that I can find who actually did come into town on December 13th. Here too is where Walt Whitman found himself on December 19th, several days after this hospital had been established. He described it. The house is quite crowded, everything impromptu, no system, all bad enough. But I have no doubt the best that can be done. All the wounds pretty bad, some frightful. The men in their old clothes, unclean and bloody. Some of the wounded are rebel officers, prisoners, one, a Mississippian, a captain, hit badly in the leg. I talked with him for some time. He asked for papers, which I gave him. I went through the rooms, downstairs and up. Some of the men were dying. I had nothing to give at that visit, but wrote a few letters to folks at home, mothers, etc. Also talked to 3 or 4 who seemed most susceptible to it and needy. Often I wondered how many families in the North have letters from their loved ones, dictated by their loved ones in the hand of Walt Whitman in their attics, and have no idea that it's Walt Whitman's hand. On December 16th, just 3 days after the battle, the Union Army started sending its wounded to Washington by rail to Aquia Landing and then steamboat up to Alexandria. By the 20th of December, most were gone, and by December 26th, the day after Christmas, all of the wounded were gone. The other side of this coin. As the Union Army left, the Confederates returned to Fredericksburg. Only a few hundred civilians probably remained in Fredericksburg during the battle itself. And in fact, in April of 1863, before the Battle of Chancellorsville, months after Fredericksburg, still probably fewer than 1,000 of the original 5,000 residents of Fredericksburg were still living in town. We know that because we can see how many people voted for mayor that spring. And it was about 1/5 of the number who had voted in 1861. The Confederates came down off the heights, along Hanover Street, along William Street, and into town. One South Carolinian noted the dead dogs, cats, and pigs that lay scattered over the neighborhood. Matilda Hamilton, who lived at a place called Forest Hill, visited her sister's house, a place we know today as the Sentry Box, Charlie McDaniel's place. This is the most vivid image we have of a damaged home in Fredericksburg. This is taken from the south, on the south facade of the house, the front being to your left. It looks a little bit better today. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
We went to the Sentry Box first.
Not to you.
We went to the Sentry Box first. It was a wreck. It is a wreck. It seemed so calm and beautiful to me last summer when the Yankees occupied Fredericksburg. Now, almost a heap of ruins. All the handsome furniture had been removed. But Sister Charlotte left her wardrobe, a very dear mahogany one, in her bureau. Also a very neat bookcase and a good many pictures. The old clock. They were all gone. Under Sister Charlotte's chamber window lay a dead Yankee. Died as he fell, for he was on his face. A party of our soldiers with perfect unconcern were laughing and eating in another part of the yard. I saw dead Yankees everywhere. To points across the South went descriptions of Fredericksburg. In the central Georgia, in Augusta, in Atlanta, this letter appeared on January 7th, 1863. On Wednesday, the 17th, I rode through the town, and it was distressing to view the desolation. There is scarcely a house in the town that has not some mark of ruins. Chimneys knocked off, roofs torn up, walls scarred with holes of various sizes, some as large as a man's head, and others as large as a barrel. The streets are covered with broken glass. Window shutters and furniture of various descriptions. The large, tall houses suffered more than the low buildings. The large Baptist church has 15 large holes through its walls, 4 through the steeple, and the roof torn up in many places. I think there are 25 or 30 houses burned. A few citizens remained in town, secreted in cellars during the whole siege. About 100 buildings, in fact, were destroyed or so badly damaged that they needed to be torn down before the end of the war in Fredericksburg. About 1/10 of the town. The first American town to be bombarded by Americans. The bombardment rankled people, but the looting enraged the South. In Augusta, Georgia, what was this account? There was not a single store or dwelling in the city that has not been broken up and open and robbed. They have thrown beds into the streets, broken the furniture, torn up the clothing of both sexes and ages, and done every conceivable thing which they alone are capable of perpetrating. One of the most important outcomes of the Battle of Fredericksburg is an intensification of the bitterness of this war. We often like to view this as kind of the Brothers' War, some sort of slaughter without rancor. But in fact, there was great rancor. And what happened to Fredericksburg enraged the South. Behold the tenements of our friends, and all sympathetic feelings vanish, and regrets arise that their mutilated carcasses do not lie across and pile on every field. Edward Heineken recorded his reaction when he came into town. He, the confectioner. A number of houses were burned down, many more made untenable by shot and shell. Hardly one having escaped entirely. The few stores that did business were despoiled of their contents. Private houses, pianos smashed, pictures wantonly ruined, clocks broken, books torn. But for all this loss, the residents considered themselves amply repaid when they viewed the thousands of the enemy's corpses upon them. Said one of Stuart's cavalrymen, if we desire a bloody revenge, we have got it. And said another cavalryman, no victory of the war has ever done me so much good. I hate them worse than ever. In fact, I don't do anything from morning to night but hate them worse and worse. The loss of Fredericksburg, the suffering of Fredericksburg, stimulated one of the first and largest relief efforts in American history. Southerners, the Army, common citizens from as far away as Louisiana sent as much as $200,000 to Fredericksburg to help recompense the residents here for the damage that they had suffered. The term Fredericksburg sufferers became part of the Southern lexicon. And then came the burial of the dead. On December 17th, on this field, looking out from in front of Federal Hill, out to Maurice Heights in the distance, that's Hanover Street on the right-hand side. The Union Army, the Confederate Army, agreed on a truce in order to bury the dead. Battlefield plunderers may be divided into three classes, wrote one Fredericksburg man. The first upon the field run hastily along from corpse to corpse, inverting the pockets, keeping an eye to watches and jewelry. The next class are content with canteens, boots, greatcoats, and pants. And the last are gleaners, who have to put up with underclothing. These are still at work, even while the burial party are performing the last offices for the dead. Around the Stratton house, the dead were the thickest. The house still stands today on Oak Street. Many of the Federal soldiers had found death seeking shelter in the small courtyards of the houses, behind the wooden plank fences surrounding them, and heaps of the corpses of these poor fellows filled the narrow enclosures. On a space of land not 2 acres, we counted 680 dead bodies. More than 1,200 altogether were found in a small plain between the Heights and Fredericksburg, mostly between Hanover Street and what is today Lafayette Boulevard. The nearest town had been mostly killed by artillery. And at least 2 men noticed a peculiar episode on the plain west of Fredericksburg. One Confederate described it. The worst sight I saw was 3 days afterwards. I didn't mind the heaps of dead nor nothing, but just a starving dog sitting by a corpse, which he wouldn't let anyone come near, and which he never left, night or day. By George, that was an easy crime. We finally had to shoot the dog to get at the man to bury him. And so suffering and pain comes in every possible form. On the 17th, the armies met to bury the dead in front of Maurice Heights. One Union soldier said, "What a day this has been to me," he said. "Oh, the dreadful, horrid sights I've witnessed are enough to sicken one of war and to force him to use every consideration before he would try it again." That, by the way, is why nations go to war, episodically, over generations. We buried 23 in one hole and 125 in another. Frank Percy is missing. In the first lot, there was a young fellow shot in the head, I believe, who made me think of Frank. If he was killed, that must have been him. His hair was dark brown, but Frank's used to be black. Perhaps he may be wounded in some hospital. We laid the poor fellows side by side in the trench and covered them with earth, where they will remain until the great judgment day. Oh, what a dreadful war this is. So too around the hospitals, burials. Walt Whitman wrote in his notebook on December 26th in Stafford County. There was a row of graves there already, each with a slat of board, generally a piece of barrelhead, on which was inscribed the name of the soldier. Death is nothing here. As you step out on the morning from your tent to wash your face, you see before you on a stretcher a shapeless, extended object, and over it is sewn a dark gray blanket. It is the corpse of some wounded or sick soldier who died in the hospital tent during the night. Perhaps there's a row of 3 or 4 of these corpses lying covered over. No one makes an ado. All useless ceremony is omitted. At the end of the war, Union burial parties from the city of Fredericksburg, from the sunken road to the river to about Hawk Street and down to Charlie's house, disinterred 2,017 bodies from the backyards and fields in and around Fredericksburg. The word of Fredericksburg spread across the American landscape with incredible power. Some families suffered shock and relief. The family of George Rollins read in the newspaper that he had been wounded at Fredericksburg. On December 20th, 1862, in hospital, he wrote home to them. "You have heard of my being wounded, I presume, but do not know how bad. The ball entered just at the side of the cap of the joint and is now in my arm. The surgeons cannot find it. I've been wounded 1 week now, and the wound is doing well. I have suffered considerable pain, but it's not so bad now. I suppose you know something about the awful slaughter of Saturday last. The account is enough to make one shudder, and it seems terrible to make such havoc among men for nothing." George S. Rollins of the 3rd Maine Infantry was admitted to a general hospital in Washington, D.C. on December 23rd, 1862. On January 13th, 1863, he died. From this side of the river, a Confederate of the 13th Georgia wrote home to his cousin, who happened to be married to another man in his regiment. "Dear Cousin Sally, it is with feelings of sadness that I attempt to write you this evening, for I suppose ere this reaches you, you will have heard that Dick is no more. He died on the night of the 16th, having been wounded severely on Sunday. He lived about 2 days and a half after receiving the wound, died about 11 o'clock. At the same time and by the same ball, Clem Maddox was killed. They, with 2 others, having been detailed to go after water, they were struck by a solid cannonball. Dick's left arm was badly shattered near the shoulder, and the arm amputated there. He was buried on the farm of Captain John Alsop, which is just below the country club, by the way, 5 miles from Fredericksburg, and 200 yards of the Richmond and Fredericksburg Railroad, under a small persimmon tree, near 2 other graves, under a larger persimmon. His overcoat was left in charge of a Negro boy on the same farm, with instructions to deliver it to anyone who should come after the body. I have been this precise, thinking you might probably sometime wish the body sent for. Cousin Sally, you will please accept our heartfelt sympathies in your sad bereavement. No one feels the loss more keenly than I do myself. My heart saddens at the pain and anguish this wicked war has caused. P.S. Those who attended the burial said the corpse was interred decently in a coffin, much better than soldiers usually are. In the Camden, New Jersey Democrat of December 22nd, 1862 appeared this short notice, a small article, barely an inch of type. One of the saddest events to us connected to the Battle of Fredericksburg is the death of Sergeant Major of the 15th New Jersey Regiment, John P. Fowler, of Franklin Furnace, Sussex County, a cousin of the colonel of the regiment. He was struck in the leg by a rifle ball and bled to death in less than 5 minutes. He was a large, powerful man, brave and generous to a fault. He leaves a widow and 9 children. John Fowler was 44 years old and served in the 15th New Jersey with 2 of his sons, Albert and Henry. Henry was 19 years old at the Battle of Fredericksburg. Sergeant Fowler, here's his headstone, had proven himself to be a good soldier and was slated for a promotion, a commission as a lieutenant in the regiment. When he fell, as he bled to death, the colonel of the regiment decided to give the commission destined for him instead to his son. And his son assumed a second lieutenancy in the regiment at the age of 19. He would go on to be seriously wounded at Spotsylvania, captured, and would spend most of the rest of the war in Confederate prison. His cousin, Colonel Fowler, had inscribed upon his tomb, "He died for the maintenance of the Union, the Constitution, and the laws." Most died without much notice. In fact, most died without any notice at all in the historical record. A few had maybe some slight observation. This one by Walt Whitman. Charlie Parker, Company E, 51st New York. Then I heard of Charlie Parker, a young man in Company E, in the 51st, how he was shot on the advance of Fredericksburg. Died hard, suffered much, frothed at the mouth. His body in return found entirely stripped by the secession and was decently buried by his companions. He was a noble, beloved young man, a clean, gallant soul, a lad of the 51st, old Brooklyn. The great irony of this war of ours is this. To a point, the suffering of a nation only steals them further. But there is a point beyond which the will of that nation and the people within it to continue diminishes. That is what war is. To make it so harsh, so deadly, so painful, and so destructive. Some in the Union, after the Battle of Fredericksburg, in fact, did waver. In fact, I would argue that it was probably the low point of the war for the Union war effort. And there were some who felt that the Union was at, or at least very near, that point where the effort, the expenditure, the pain and the suffering was deemed not worth it. One man from Pennsylvania said in the days following Fredericksburg, "Oh, my country, how my heart bleeds for your welfare. If this poor life of mine could save you, how willingly I would make the sacrifice." Walt Whitman spent about a week in Fredericksburg, and he, maybe better than anybody else, would sense the shock waves and understand the shock waves that reverberated from this place that winter. And for him, the experience at Fredericksburg brought clarity of purpose, and it rendered all else virtually irrelevant. He wrote to his mother on December 29th, "And now that I have lived for 8 or 9 days amid such scenes as the camps furnish, and had a practical part in all, and realized the way that hundreds of thousands of good men are now living, and have had to live for a year or more, not only without any of the comforts, but with death and sickness and hard marching and hard fighting, and no success at that, for their continual experience, really nothing we call trouble seems worth talking about. Nothing that we call trouble seems worth talking about." The revelation for Whitman lay in the massive effort and the astounding courage displayed in the quest for nation and the hope for a future. Effort expended against the backdrop of sadness, hurt, destruction, and death. This investment bound Whitman to the cause that he witnessed in a way that he had not been bound before, and demonstrates that those who understand best are almost always the most committed. And so, we should all try to understand. At Fredericksburg, sacrifice, sadness, hurt, destruction, and death came in a fashion and in forms not seen before, affecting soldier and civilian alike, challenging the will of all. And remember, the intent of war is to defeat the will of all. What's truly amazing is that against this backdrop of horror, and fully aware, these men, and indeed women, and even children in this community, endured through it. They still came. They committed. They understood in the hope for a better life, or what they saw as a better nation, be they Southern or Northern. I'll close with a letter written on Christmas Day, 1862, by a Confederate cavalry. He said this: "I hardly have the right heart to wish you a Merry Christmas this beautiful Christmas morning, because I know well that merriment is not for you this day." He's writing to his wife. "I thought of the children when I first awoke this morning, and wondered what you managed to put in their stockings. Remember, we went back to the many happy Christmas days we have spent together with them. Alas, will the good old times ever return again, and you and I and our little ones dwell together in peace? I hope so. I believe so. But the heart sickens with the deferred hope. That man's hope is, in fact, of course, our reality. A world of peace and family. We ought to revel in it, but we also ought to never forget that it was not always so in the past.